Shortly, and we'll bring you live coverage here on C-SPAN, and over on C-SPAN 2 you can watch coverage of the Senate. Thanks for watching today. Enjoy your weekend.
The House will be in order. The Chair lays before the House a communication from the Speaker.
The Speaker's Rooms, Washington, D.C., October 11, 2013. I hereby appoint the Honorable Doug Collins to act as Speaker pro tempore on this day. Signed, John A. Boehner, Speaker of the House of Representatives.
The prayer will be offered by Chaplain Father Conroy.
Let us pray. Loving God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. Lord, you know there are many Americans who look to the People's House as uncertainty about the future of the economy and their livelihoods hang in a balance. Petty partisanship and ever-politicizing rhetoric should have no place at all when men and women of goodwill come together to serve the common good. We ask again that you bless the members of the People's House with the understanding that it is their work to develop the strategies and plans to assuage the fears of their fellow countrymen and women. We ask again that you impel those who possess power here in the Capitol to be mindful of those whom they represent, who possess little or no power, and whose lives are made all the more difficult by a failure to work out serious differences. May all that is done today be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceeding and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina rise?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Clause 1, Rule 1, I demand a vote on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal.
The question is on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. Opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I object to the vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present and make the point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question are postponed. The Pledge of Allegiance will be led by the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
The Chair will now entertain up to 5 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and advise on extent my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, in July, I stood at this same podium arguing it shouldn't take a government shutdown threat each year to force Congress to do its job. I voted against Congress adjourning for the month of August, insisting that Congress remain to complete critical business. The work of the people remains unfinished. Today is day 11 of the government shutdown. Thousands of workers stay home without a paycheck, and yet Congress has not done its job. This shutdown has failed to will Congress and the administration to the finish line, and we have seen a cycle of crisis management rather than responsible governing. Mr. Speaker, Washington is broken. This is not governing. This is not what our founding fathers intended. I urge Congress and the leadership in Washington to return to regular order of business instead of governing by crisis. Let's responsibly govern by getting the people's business completed on time. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose, the gentleman from New York rise?
Yes, the unanimous consent of the House to speak for 1 minute and to revise and extend.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As we slug through the second week of the government shutdown, American families and small businesses are hurting. Every day of the last 10 days, I have been contacted by constituents who cannot operate their stores, pay tribute to their loved ones at a federal memorial, or secure a small business loan. These unnecessary hardships damage our economy and could have been avoided if House Republicans were not obsessed with taking away health care benefits from public we serve. Government has the duty to keep its doors open, provide vital services, and pay its bills. These items should not be considered a Democratic Party wish list. They are basic functions of government and should not be used as an opportunity to secure political points or hold America's economy hostage. It is well past time to vote to end the government shutdown, pay our bills, get the nation back to work, and grow our economy. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Tennessee rise?
To address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, a picture's worth 1,000 words, and I felt like it was appropriate today because so many of our colleagues say, why do we want to discuss Obamacare when we talk about the budget or talk about the continuing resolution? And here is the reason why. It is a program that is too expensive to afford. Take a look at this graph. We all know that supposedly when Obama started out, by the way, as a program, an insurance access program for the nearly 40 million that didn't have insurance, it was to be under $1 trillion. Exactly $863 billion. So now we look at what has happened to the growth of this program, and CBO shows us, looking at this, when you address $1.4 trillion, $1.7, we're now at $2.6 trillion in cost over a 10-year period of time. So to my colleagues, Mr. Speaker, I say this is why we have to put this program on the table and discuss it. It is now a nationalization of 17% of our nation's economy and has gone from under $1 trillion to $2.6 trillion. Let's get the spending under control. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio rise?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, please.
Without objection.
As the House Republicans continue to shut down our federal government, I rise to draw attention to the impact it's having on our labor markets and job creation in this country. The House Republican shutdown has prevented even the Bureau of Labor Statistics from releasing the September jobs report. And the Bureau is down to just 3 employees from its usual number, while the Republican shutdown is in effect making it impossible to compile the data for a jobs report for our country. All we know is that our labor market, the number of people applying for unemployment benefits increased somewhere between 66,000 and 374,000 people. We don't know what the unemployment rate actually is because we don't know how many people are looking for work, and we can't find the data. So we don't know what actually happened completely in September and this month. This is creating needless uncertainty in our markets and makes it harder for businesses to know what is actually happening in our economy. Before the House Republicans shut down the government, what we did know about our labor market was we still had 11 million people looking for work following the deepest recession since the Great Depression. Mr. Speaker, it's time for the Republicans to bring the clean continuing resolution to the floor that has their budget number in it, and let's reopen the government.
Gentlelady's time expired. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from North Carolina rise?
I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, it's time for solutions. We're 11 days into a federal government shutdown and days away from exhausting government's $16.7 trillion credit limit. Both parties need to be committed to opening government and getting our debt under control. House Republicans want to reopen the government, pay our bills, and defend America's credit rating. So let's keep talking and work to build common ground. It doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. Each side can see the mathematical writing on the wall. In 10 years, discretionary spending will grow 17%. Meanwhile, mandatory spending on our debt drivers will grow 79%. Let's agree to start there. Let's reopen government, and let's reform what's driving our debt. Let's talk about making our tax code fairer and more competitive. Let's do the responsible thing to make sure we don't find ourselves in this situation year after year. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey rise?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The House Republicans don't want to reopen the government. If they did, all they have to do is bring up the Senate clean resolution, pass it here on the floor today, It'll go back to the Senate. I don't even know if it has to go back to the Senate, and the President has already agreed to sign it. They are keeping the government closed as hostage because they want to negotiate I don't even know what anymore. Initially, it was because they wanted to repeal or defund the Affordable Care Act. I'm not sure it's even that anymore. I think sometimes they just want to keep the government closed to show that they can. Clearly, the budget numbers are there. We have agreed to their budget numbers, so that's not the issue. So, Speaker Boehner, please, bring up a clean resolution today. The impact on the economy is getting to be more and more devastating every day. As my colleagues have mentioned, more and more jobs are being lost. Instead of losing jobs, Speaker Boehner, we should be here trying to create jobs and use the government to work with the private sector to create jobs and grow the economy. Don't continue to keep this government shut down. It's 2 weeks now. And the longer it goes on, the more it's going to have an impact on the economy and make it more difficult to create jobs. We will continue to lose jobs. Bring up the clean resolution, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose, the gentleman from Florida rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's been a while. I know the American people are frustrated with the shutdown, and a week from now the country will default if action is not taken. How we got in this situation is not that complicated. You can only continue to spend so much of the public's money, and then you run out of the public's money. After years, 4 years of unchecked spending when the Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, it's caught up with us. We put the brakes on 2 years ago, and this is a difficult way to put the brakes on now. No one likes it. The American people don't like it. But we've got to get our spending. We've got to get our debt under control. You continue to spend, you incur debt. Next week, we'll go from $17 trillion to probably a request for another $1 trillion. That's not sustainable. We must work together to resolve this in the long-term interest and national economic and financial security of our nation. I yield back the balance of my time.
Time has expired. Pursuant to Clause 4 of Rule 1, the following enrolled joint resolution was signed by the Speaker on Thursday, October the 10th, 2013.
House Joint Resolution 91, making continuing appropriations for death gratuities and related survivor benefits for survivors of deceased military service members of the Department of Defense for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
Thanks, sir. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 371, I call up Joint Resolution H.J. Res. 76, a joint resolution making appropriations for the National Nuclear Security Administration for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes, and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the joint resolution.
House Joint Resolution 76, joint resolution making continuing appropriations for the National Nuclear Security Administration for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to House Resolution 371, the joint resolution is considered read. The joint resolution shall be debatable for 40 minutes, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking minority member of the Committee on Appropriations. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Frelinghuysen, and the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Capiter, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials in House Joint Resolution 76, and that I may include tabular material on the same.
Without objection. So ordered. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized for as much time as he may consume.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to present critical legislation to ensure our nation's nuclear security, the Nuclear Weapons Security and Non-Proliferation Act, that joint resolution just mentioned. This legislation continues funding for the National Nuclear Security Administration at the current level provided in fiscal year 2013 until December 15th, or until a full year of appropriations have been signed into law. There are no new anomalies and there is no special treatment, but continuing these activities without interruption is vital to our national defense. The National Nuclear Security Administration is responsible for maintaining our nuclear deterrent, securing vulnerable nuclear materials around the world to keep them out of the hands of terrorists, and supporting our Navy's nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft carriers. Funds will be used to keep the doors open so our scientists and engineers can keep our nuclear arsenal at the ready and our nuclear fleet operating efficiently. These vital programs keep our country safe and secure and require well-trained, dedicated personnel. So far, these high-priority national security missions have been sustained during this shutdown by operating off prior year funding. While most of the Department of Energy's science and energy laboratories have enough carryover funding to operate through November, the national security laboratories and stockpile production sites of the NNSA are not in that same position. This week, the NNSA sites began notifying workers that they would be shutting down as early as October 17th to preserve remaining funds for essential functions like protecting nuclear materials. By the end of the month, 90% of personnel at our nuclear weapons sites may be laid off, halting work to keep our nuclear weapons reliable. And once laid off, some of these vital workers may never return. Suspending an ongoing nuclear production operation is no simple task, and that interruption will lead to higher costs and only make it more difficult to maintain an aging stockpile. We must act now to prevent disruption of these important nuclear security activities. We must also sustain the critical work that the NNSA's non-proliferation experts perform overseas. Despite hopeful press reports, Iran has not turned off its centrifuges. North Korea may have restarted its reactors to make more plutonium. And the Russian and Chinese governments continue to build nuclear-armed ballistic submarines. The technical expertise provided by our nuclear security experts is essential to our nation's ability to monitor and respond to international developments such as these. We can simply not afford to lose this oversight of nuclear weapons and their potential for proliferation. Finally, our nuclear deterrent relies on the mission of our submarines, the very capable assets of which are maintained by the Naval Reactors Program at the Department of Energy. We must ensure they have adequate support to perform their mission across the globe. Colleagues, I do recognize that this bill will not solve the larger funding problem. We must enact full-year annual appropriations that meet today's requirements as voted on earlier this year and not rely on continuing resolutions to keep the government open. In this regard, my thanks to Ranking Member Kaptur for her leadership and support of our annual appropriations process. Until we get back to regular order, this bill will provide critical funding to our nation's security, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentlewoman from Ohio is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my colleague, Congressman Frelinghuysen, for his comments, though obviously I have serious reservations about this bill because our country has been the world's shining example in how a democratic republic can actually work efficiently, successfully, democratically. Yet today we continue with the shenanigans from a minority of the majority, wasting God's good time. For my colleagues who are listening and for the country, let me say this bill should be coming to the floor at a level of $31.6 billion to meet the national security, energy, and water needs of this country. The measure before us today contains $10.6 billion and only deals with the nuclear security portion of the legislation. That is simply not sufficient for this great country. We cannot continue to be governed by staggering from manufactured crisis to manufactured crisis. And the folly, some would say madness, of what is going on here must be stopped. It is creating great uncertainty inside this economy, and it is harming us now globally with our trading partners and with countries who simply can't understand what is happening here. Over the course of the last several weeks, my Republican colleagues have loudly called for compromise. They've said negotiate to reopen the government, but all the while changing their demands daily and moving the goalposts. They moved it up the field, down the field, off the field. We start the day, we never know exactly where we are. Mr. Speaker, the Democratic members of this House have agreed to a total spending level that is the Republican level, $986 billion for all of our bills. That is not a number I personally agree with. It will not meet our nation's needs, but it is a compromise offered in good faith to move our country forward. My advice to all those who are listening is bring that clean continuing resolution with the Republican budget number in it to the floor. Let's reopen the government and we can deal with other tangential issues that have nothing to do with operating the government of the United States. Our economy is still in the process of recovering from a horrible Great Recession. We have still not come back to the pre-employment levels in this country that were so deeply harmed by the Wall Street-induced housing crisis. Shouldn't we be debating ways to spur economic growth, not continuing to debate a shutdown that is slowing economic growth? We have had, under the Obama administration, 42 months of economic growth every single month. We are crawling out of a mammoth hole. And the American people view the disarray here as very, very destabilizing to their own security, because they're worried about their futures, and what's going on here simply adds to their anxiety. For the entire country, the Republican shutdown is already having real and negative consequences. Over 800,000 workers have been furloughed. They're having to borrow on their credit cards because they don't know how they're going to make their mortgage payment. They have to put their kids in school. They have to buy groceries from coast to coast. We know that although we don't have people in place at the Department of Labor right now, we know that over 66,000 up to 300,000 more unemployment claims have now been filed in the country because of what's going on due to these 800,000 more people that have got some form of a pink slip. For the entire country, this shutdown is wrong and unnecessary. The impacts will be felt across this economy, and already are, in the services that the American taxpayers pay for and that the federal government has up to now provided. As we continue to shortchange critical energy and infrastructure investments so vital to a strong economy, we will witness as dusk follows dawn the slowing of economic growth and the hindering of American competitiveness. Let me turn to what is not funded by the piecemeal approach that this bill represents. Our bill should be coming to the floor with all the parts of the Department of Energy and Army Corps of Engineers and National Nuclear Security Administration in it. The bill should be coming to us at a level of $31 billion. This bill is but one-third of that at a level of $10.6 billion, two-thirds underfunded. Let me turn to what is not funded in the bill that is before us. First of all, the Corps of Engineers, one of the most important instrumentalities in our government to create jobs, is not even in this cynical bill. Communities across our country will continue to feel the consequences of this decreased investment. We should be doing more to prevent flooding, to build infrastructure, to create jobs, not less. For those of you that have been yelling from the rooftops about the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund, this bill does nothing, zero, for your ports and harbors. This bill does not fund any of the energy technology accounts so critical to our nation becoming energy independent again. As our foreign competitors double down to develop 21st century technology, look at the Chinese stealing our solar technology, and undermine our markets through illegal dumping and intellectual property poaching, our choice in this bill, do nothing. So renewable energy will receive cost competitiveness by whom? Which countries will succeed? Who will develop it and own that technology? According to this, we're ceding the turf to them, ceding the field to them. If you look at U.S. trade accounts, you don't have to be a mathematical genius. What is the #1 category of trade deficit of this country? Imported energy. And what is the #2 category of trade deficit? Automotive and automotive parts. It's all connected. If America doesn't heal those accounts, we become weaker as a country. We have fewer jobs here at home, fewer wealth creation here at home. And this particular bill is absent any forward thinking about new energy systems for our country. The United States has spent, get this, $2.3 trillion importing petroleum just since 2003. That's with a T. That's trillion. I hear my colleagues on the other side of the aisle say, oh, we have a $17 trillion debt that we have to pay off. We sure do. And where do you think it's come from? It's come from the lack of wealth creation inside this country for a quarter century. A quarter century, starting with imported energy. This represents thousands and thousands and millions of jobs across this country lost and dollars out of the pockets of working-class Americans who see their purchases of fuel transferred to build giant hotels in Dubai, supporting universities in Dubai, all across the Middle East, while we see companies close, communities shut down, Detroit go bankrupt, all these problems inside our country because we are not energy independent and we are not transportation independent. These are dollars spent not in much needed American job creation, but siphoned off overseas, assisting our competitors in developing their economies and their energy futures, not our own. Is it any wonder that America has a debt? It is rooted in very major holes inside this economy. You could start with 2 wars. What have those cost us? Probably $4 to $6 trillion unpaid for. There wasn't any war tax imposed when President Bush took us to war. I remember Donald Rumsfeld saying, well, you got to go to war with the military you have. Well, they borrowed to do that, and now this president has begun to keep his promise to the American people. We're out of Iraq and we're moving out of Afghanistan as we try to hold those sad places together with our allies. The housing crisis of 2008, it's anybody's guess what that cost us, but we know it hollowed out money creation in this country. We had the largest transfer of wealth and loss of equity in modern history. You think you crawl out of that in a month or 2 months? It takes years. And we've had 42 months of steady job creation. The trade deficit, America hasn't had a balanced trade account in 3 decades. In 3 decades. In the cumulative loss, get this number, since 1975, the cumulative trade deficit of this country was $8.4 trillion. More petroleum coming in here from abroad than American energy exports out. More cars in here from abroad and auto parts than auto parts out. More electronics components coming in here than American electronics exports out. So if you add up $8.4 trillion of trade deficit, $6 trillion of war expenditures, if you take the cost of the meltdown on Wall Street, only God knows how many trillions that cost us. Is it any wonder that the United States has a budget deficit and debt, and the federal government trying to hold the republic together in our 50 states from coast to coast? Pretty clear to me what's going on here. So we look at this bill. Our republic will not compete in the 21st century and beyond if we further reduce investments in energy and cede our energy future to other countries. The bill before us today does nothing about that. And in fact, in one of the most important related sectors to us, manufacturing, this bill does nothing in manufacturing. One of the reasons we don't have as much economic muscle in this country is because every community you go to, what do you see? Shuttered factories. Shuttered. Every product you pick up, what does it say? Made in China, made in China, made in China. Anytime I go to the store and find anything made in America, I buy it in hopes it'll help somebody, somewhere along the way. This bill does nothing for manufacturing. We've lost 15% of our manufacturing jobs, and it isn't just because of technology. It's because they have been shipped out, outsourced, made in China, not made in the USA. Made in country, some of my constituents don't even know where they are. And these goods come in here. And every time American jobs get displaced in the manufacturing sector, 8.8 million manufacturing jobs disappeared. Manufacturing remains one of the most important drivers in our economy, and yet we have a huge trade deficit in manufacturing. There is little merit in using federal dollars to foster technological advances or breakthroughs for products that are not ultimately manufactured domestically in our country. This bill usually provides a means for us to do more to reverse the trend of domestic firms shifting manufacturing overseas because, to put it simply, domestic manufacturing drives domestic innovation, and that drives wealth creation and job creation in our country. This bill does nothing in the advanced manufacturing sector. Off the table. How sad. How sad for those people across our country who know the value added from manufacturing. This bill does nothing for science or advanced science and energy. Return on investment from our publicly funded research and development ranges from 20 to 67%. What a bang for the buck. With this rate of return, we should be passing a bill that invests in science and high sciences, but that is not happening inside this bill. In fact, across this country, at all of our major labs, the workers are furloughed at Livermore, at Sandia, at Argonne. The brain power of this country is being put on the shelf while they watch this charade here inside this chamber. This bill does nothing to address funding for the Office of Environmental Management, whose mission is to complete the safe cleanup of what they call environmental legacy, I call nuclear mess, brought about from 5 decades of nuclear weapons development and government-sponsored nuclear energy research. So, what do we do to clean up nuclear mess around our country in this bill? Zero. We do nothing. And what about our promises to the people who live near those communities? What about those who sacrificed so much for America's nuclear superiority? We shut the door. So long. Nothing. Nothing in this bill. This energy and water bill is one of the most critical investments we can make in this country. It should promote job creation. It should ensure national security. It should protect and promote our vital infrastructure and advance American competitiveness through energy independence and strengthening manufacturing and scientific capability right here at home, right here in the good old USA. Unfortunately, a minority of the majority of Republicans are choosing to ignore all of these critical investments to execute a blatantly political stunt that is already harming our country, upsetting our people, and tamping down on job growth. Mr. Speaker, our nation is stronger when we come together. We as the people can solve the serious challenges facing our country, yet here we find ourselves today again wasting time on a lopsided bill which only extends the GOP-driven shutdown. We should be spending our time on passing a clean, continuing resolution, not hold the entire country hostage to a reckless political stunt that some must get great pleasure out of, but it's such a sadistic approach to governing this country. We ought to work together toward a long-term solution, not continue to reward a faction of one party which has no interest in governing this country. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Rogers of Kentucky.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding me this time, and I rise in support of this Nuclear Weapons Security and Non-Proliferation Act. And yes, it's a narrow scope, but it's a terribly important piece of the government. Like the bill we passed yesterday, this legislation addresses matters of critical importance to our national security. The National Nuclear Security Administration maintains our nuclear deterrence here at home, but also helps to ensure that nuclear weapons and materials don't fall into the wrong hands, those of terrorists and other enemies of our nation. H.J. Res. 76 provides funding for the NNSA to continue this vital work to keep our nuclear arsenal at the ready and our Navy ships powered, and ultimately to keep this country safe and secure and protected. This is particularly important at a time when we face multiple threats from unpredictable nations and groups. When our government shut down, it did not also shut down nuclear power reactors, research, and testing in Iraq, Iran, or North Korea. Funding is provided at the current annual rate of $10.59 billion to sustain the national labs, continue the work of skilled workers and scientists, conduct ongoing non-proliferation intelligence operations, and maintain the safety and readiness of our nuclear stockpile. As with the prior 14 mini-CRs this House has passed in the last week, this language is essentially identical to what was included in my initial short-term continuing resolution. So this is a clean bill, Mr. Speaker, adhering to the Senate's demands in that regard. And also, as with the prior bills, this funding will last until December 15th or until full-year appropriations are enacted. It's my hope that the latter is what happens. Our nation deserves the certainty of an adequately funded government with appropriations bills that reflect current needs but also current fiscal restraints. To achieve this, we must come together with our Senate counterparts and have a meaningful discussion that establishes a single common top-line number for discretionary spending that members of both parties and both houses of Congress can work toward. The ongoing standoffs are not productive. They aren't getting us any closer to reopening the government. While it's not the ideal path forward, at this time, passing this funding bill does get us a step closer to ending the shutdown, which I know is the goal of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. So far, this House has voted on a bipartisan basis to reopen critical government functions, including support for those who serve the country in the Department of Defense. Our nuclear security efforts are equally important to our defense and should have ongoing funding to keep the country safe and sound. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill. Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Kentucky yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentlelady from Ohio.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, might I inquire as to the time remaining on this side, please?
The gentlelady has 4.5 minutes, and the gentleman has 12.
I would like to yield 1.5 minutes to our esteemed ranking member from the state of New York, Congresswoman Nita Lowey.
The gentlelady from New York is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to the Republican shutdown. Of course, we support funding for nuclear weapons security and non-proliferation activities, but this bill does nothing to address a number of other critical energy and water priorities, including the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Energy's Office of Science, ARPA-E, the Office of Environmental Management, which is responsible for cleaning up 5 decades worth of weapons development and nuclear energy research. Even if House Republicans' irresponsible piecemeal bills were enacted at the rate they are going, it would take until after Christmas before the government is fully up and running. We could end the shutdown today if Republican leadership would just allow a vote. And the claim that Democrats won't negotiate is a farce, my friends. Throughout the year, we pleaded with Republicans to sit down, negotiate a broader budget agreement. Dozens of times Republicans have refused. Now, after wasting the first 10 months of the year, after shutting down the government as they steer the country towards economic catastrophe, they claim they want to negotiate. Democrats and the President have already agreed to the Republicans' funding level. If only Republicans would allow a vote, We could have the government reopen tonight. Vote no on this bill, and let's vote to immediately end the Republican shutdown. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Fleischman.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And to all of my colleagues in this great United States House of Representatives, I want to ask each and every one of you to support this bill. I am privileged to represent the 3rd District of Tennessee, Mr. Chairman. In the 3rd District of Tennessee, this is a very special city. It's called Oak Ridge. It's at one point in time was called the Secret City. That's where we had the Manhattan Project and brought World War II to a close because of the efforts of the men and women who worked there and who succeeded there. We won the Cold War there. And today, this bill does one very specific thing. It honors the almost 5,000 workers who work every day at the Y-12 National Security Complex for our nuclear deterrent. Let me be clear. This is not a matter of partisan politics. This is a matter of national security. And I stand here putting a very human face on this for the workers who work hard every day, who have toiled for years. They deserve better, and this bill does that. Again, let me be clear. Y-12 is going through an orderly shutdown. We cannot allow this to happen, not as Republicans, not as Democrats, but as Americans. The nation's security is at risk. This bill keeps Y-12 open, and this is exactly what we need to do. So let's put aside the partisan rhetoric, and let's honor the hardworking men and women of Y-12. Let's keep them working, and let's keep the greatest nation on the face of the earth safe and secure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentlelady from Ohio.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield 1 minute and 15 seconds to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Hakeem Jeffries.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute and 15 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, this is day 11 of the reckless Republican shutdown of the United States government, and you have still failed to provide a way out of the mess that you've created. The communities that I represent in Brooklyn and Queens are still struggling from the devastation of Superstorm Sandy, and yet this bill fails to fund the Army Corps of Engineers. This was a wholesale government shutdown, and all that is offered is a piecemeal reopening. You have burned down the entire house, but offer only to rebuild the kitchen. That is a shameful dereliction of duty and a woefully inadequate remedy. This shutdown is hurting the American people. It is undemocratic, unconscionable, unnecessary, unreasonable, and unjust. And it's time to get back to doing the business of the American people. Let's reopen the entire government. Vote no on this piecemeal approach.
The gentleman from New York yields back. The gentlelady from Ohio reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, pleased to recognize the gentleman from Texas, a member of the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Thornberry, for 2 minutes.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I commend the gentleman from New Jersey for his leadership and for bringing this measure to the floor. The bill he brought to the floor on Wednesday, just the day before yesterday, passed the House, passed the Senate, and it was signed into law by the President last night. So the argument that you can't fund any of the government unless you fund all of the government is obviously not true. Every single member of the House voted for the bill that the gentleman from New Jersey brought to the floor dealing with military death benefits. We have set priorities. We've said the military has to be paid. And this bill also sets priorities because the nuclear deterrent is absolutely central to our national security, just as the military is. For 60 years, the centerpiece of our country's security have been the nuclear deterrent that has helped keep us secure. They are aging weapons, however, And so that means there are maintenance issues, there are safety issues, there are reliability issues, which a very highly skilled, dedicated workforce must address every single day. And so that's what this bill does. This allows that work to continue, as well as the very important work dealing with non-proliferation, as well as keeping our nuclear-powered ships operating. All of those things central to our country's security are empowered by this bill. Mr. Speaker, it is the easiest excuse any of us can use to oppose a bill because of what it does not do. But what we ought to do is look at what a bill does do. And what this bill does do is keep this central part of our country's security operating even as we sort out our other budget woes. I think it deserves the support of all members of the House, and I encourage them to vote for it. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentlewoman from Ohio. The chair would like to announce the gentleman from New Jersey has 8 minutes left. The gentlewoman from Ohio has 2 minutes left.
I thank the Speaker and would like to yield a minute to the esteemed gentleman from New Mexico, Congressman Ben Ray Lujan.
The gentleman from New Mexico is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, funding for the NNSA is critically important to my state of New Mexico, where we are home to both Los Alamos and Sandia National Labs. However, this bill denies these national security labs the funding they need as it locks in the deep cuts of sequester for 2 more months. There's not a member of this body, Democrat or Republican, that says they like the sequester, Mr. Speaker, but my Republican colleagues refuse to lift it. And they say they want to keep the government open, but they place conditions on it. This piecemeal approach in this bill to the Department of Energy and to the NNSA is picking winners and losers with employees that are going to be furloughed. This is a shame and it's a sham. This Republican charade that is going to go home to my state of New Mexico and direct the directors of the labs to tell employees who is going to go home without a paycheck and who will not. Because there's still not assurance that the Secretary of Energy, through the Department of Energy, will make these employees whole through allowable costs that will be accepted. Enough is enough. The headlines this morning clearly show, may I have 15 more seconds?
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio.
I apologize. I have another.
Mr. Speaker, this is a shame. Let's do the right thing and open the government.
Gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from Ohio reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Heck, also a member of the House Armed Services Committee.
The gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my friend, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Frelinghuysen, for bringing this important measure to the floor. Since the start of this partial shutdown 11 days ago, the House has focused on one of our core constitutional functions, funding key portions of the federal government. We've come together in a bipartisan way several times over the past few days to pay our troops, provide benefits for the families of fallen soldiers, reopen the NIH, provide money for disaster relief efforts, and fund other crucial governmental departments and operations. These are the types of tough spending choices the American people and people in my district demand we make. When you are nearly $17 trillion in debt, you have to prioritize, just like any business or family does when funds are tight. Today, Mr. Speaker, we turn our focus to a critical issue of national security and public safety, and that is ensuring that the National Nuclear Security Administration has the funding it needs to secure our nuclear stockpile and materials. Recent reports indicate that the Department of Energy may begin furloughing employees and contractors at the 8 NNSA sites around the country starting October 21st. Sites such as the Nevada National Security Site, which is home to approximately 2,500 employees and contractors, will reduce staffings to levels sufficient to maintain, quote, minimally safe operations, end quote. This situation presents a threat to national security, public safety, and our economy. The Nevada National Security Site is charged with supporting our national stockpile. Additionally, the security site oversees the administration of training for first responders in the prevention of, protection from, and response to possible terrorist use of radiological or nuclear material. With critical functions such as these, minimally safe operations is simply not an option. And the same is true at NNSA sites around the country. The men and women who work at these sites not only have critical duties, but they are also critical to our local economies. In fact, contractors at NNSA sites may reduce their workforce by as much as 80 to 90%. Such attrition would take a great deal of money out of the economy at a time when states like mine, with an unemployment rate of 9.5%, can ill afford to lose jobs. HJRES 76 maintains our national security, prevents harm to our economy, and I urge my colleagues to support this important measure and yield back the balance of my time.
Has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentlewoman from Ohio.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would like to yield our remaining time to the gentleman from Oregon, Congressman Earl Blumenauer.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for the final 1 minute.
I appreciate the gentlelady's courtesy. One of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle talked about our being the greatest nation in the world, but they're running it like a banana republic. People who ran out of this chamber gleeful that the government was going to shut down have suddenly discovered that there's 20% of the government that they want to operate. There's a simple way to resolve this impasse. If you want to negotiate truly, appoint the conferees to the Budget Committee. The Republicans have refused to do that for 6 months. If you want to control spending, bring your own appropriations bills to the floor and see if your people have the fortitude to slash government spending further. Remember, they stopped operation on the Transportation HUD bill 2 months ago. It could be brought up today. But they refuse to do so because their spending levels are so unrealistic, their own members won't vote for it. They'd rather deal in the abstract. They'd rather hold America hostage. It's shameful. It's unnecessary. Bring a continuing resolution to the floor and put government back to work.
The gentleman's time has expired. For the gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Congressman Rodney Frelinghuysen, for your yielding, and I'm very grateful for your leadership on this issue. Funding our national security interests within the Department of Energy must be a priority in order to protect every American family. Today, the House will pass an important measure that will fund the National Nuclear Security Administration. The NNSA will provide necessary resources, which is critical, and it allows our country to continue operations for dozens of vital national security missions. I am fortunate to represent the Department of Energy's Savannah River site in Aiken and Barnwell County, South Carolina. I especially appreciate its personnel as the only member of Congress who has actually worked at the site. The passage of this bill is essential as it will provide our dedicated workers who are handling these operations the security they need to complete their vital missions. Our nation is a much safer place because of ongoing tritium operations in the mixed oxide fuel fabrication facility currently under construction at SRS. These missions are essential to our nation's national security as they allow us to service our nuclear stockpile and honor international nuclear obligations of nonproliferation. Additionally, the Savannah River site, which established victory in the Cold War, has thousands of committed employees working on Department of Energy environmental management projects. These professionals also provide crucial services to our country through their nuclear nonproliferation and environmental cleanup efforts. Although I am encouraged by today's legislation, I remain hopeful that Congress can work together to provide necessary funding for these projects as well. I appreciate Chairman Hal Rogers for bringing this bill to the floor today and urge all of my colleagues of both parties to vote in support of this legislation. I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman from South Carolina yields. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, a member of the Armed Services Committee, Mr. Turner.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairman Frelinghuysen for his dedication and commitment to the important issue of our strategic assets. When we look to the NNSA, they have had for a number of years difficulty in getting support from this administration for the important efforts of modernizing our nuclear weapons infrastructure and ensuring the strategic assets that are so essential to our nation's security. You know, this issue also is one that represents, I think, a great analogy to the difficulty that we're having in resolving this conflict. We have the President of the United States who openly states that he will have negotiations with Russia on our strategic assets, on our nuclear weapons. He will even have secret negotiations, as we saw in his open mic incident with his secret deal with the Russians concerning our missile defense systems. And yet the President openly says he will not negotiate with the legislature. He'll negotiate with Syria, he'll negotiate with Iran, but he won't negotiate with the legislature. It also, this issue illustrates some of the difficulties that we have in this House itself. We are putting on the House bills that should have 100% unanimous support. And yet, when these bills come to the House, these bills predominantly have been divided on a partisan basis because people want to say, well, it doesn't fund everything. Well, everyone knows when you have a disagreement, you start first upon the things you agree. The bills that have been coming forth on this House floor should be the things that we agree. But partisan politics continues to divide us, where instead of the House coming together on all of these bills and saying, yes, these are the things that we agree on and we'll put aside the things we disagree on for later, we have difficulty in getting even the important things done. And this is an important one. I want to thank Chairman Frelinghuysen for his commitment to ensure the safety of our nuclear deterrent, the workers and the important work that's being done at the NNSA. This is a discussion, though, that needs to go beyond just this stopgap bill and even the issue of a CR. This administration has continually cut the resources for our nuclear deterrent in ways which jeopardizes the future of our strategic assets. We need to make certain that this conversation continues. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey.
Ms. Capter, you don't have any further speakers or any?
The gentlelady from Ohio's time has expired.
Okay.
Yes, and I want to thank
I'd be happy to yield the gentlewoman a minute.
I would thank the chairman for that courtesy, and just say that I would urge my colleagues to vote no on this particular piecemeal continuing resolution, and hopefully others will come to their senses and we'll be able to vote for a clean continuing resolution, which I think the majority of members of our subcommittee would appreciate, so we can reopen the government and deal with all of the responsibilities that we have under this particular bill, and meet our responsibilities to energy and water across this country. And I thank the gentleman for his courtesy, and I hope to reciprocate.
Reclaiming my time, it's been a pleasure to work with Ms. Capter. Mr. Chairman, in closing, Robert Spalding wrote in the Washington Post recently an article called "Nuclear Weapons, Instruments of Peace." In his close, he wrote, and I quote, "The sensible path to peace starts with the realization that peace can be secured only through strength. Nuclear weapons represent that strength. We must embrace it through funding and rhetoric." End of quotation marks. Indeed we do. Nothing is more important than the reliability of our nuclear weapons stockpile, as is obviously our responsibility to the world to prevent nuclear proliferation. And one of the ways that we protect America and provide for a strong national defense is to have a strong naval reactor program, so that our aircraft carriers and subs can truly do the work of freedom. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey yields back. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 371, the previous question is ordered. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the joint resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
Joint resolution making continuing appropriations for the National Nuclear Security Administration for fiscal year 2014 and for other purposes.
Pursuant to Clause 1C of Rule 19, further consideration of House Joint Resolution 76 is postponed. Pursuant to Clause 12A of Rule 1, the House will stand in recess subject to the call of the Chair.
Live coverage of the House will continue here on C-SPAN as they have just wrapped up debate on the nuclear security funding, the latest mini-spending bill from House Republicans as it is day 11 of the government shutdown. They will be back around 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time to vote on that legislation. When that happens, we'll bring you back to the floor. In the meantime, we want to get your thoughts on the latest here in Washington. As many of you know, the House Republicans put out an